Welcome to the world of João, a young mapmaker in Portugal's age of discovery. Now settle in and get comfortable, perhaps letting out a slow, deep breath. Imagine sinking into a favorite armchair, the kind that's seen many stories and holds them gently. Let your shoulders relax and your eyelids grow heavy. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it? Is it a quiet evening in your cozy corner, or perhaps a busy morning in your perfectly organized chaos? Whatever the hour, I'm glad you're here with us. If you enjoy these journeys, consider subscribing so you don't miss another adventure. Tonight, we begin our tale with João, standing on the docks of Lisbon, the salty air a familiar scent. He's young, eager, and filled with a restless spirit, looking out at the vast blue expanse that promises so much and hides even more. The whispers of new lands, of routes to distant shores, fill his mind as he carefully prepares his instruments, his fingers tracing the lines of existing yet imperfect charts. He's ready to begin, to create the maps that will guide others, and perhaps his own destiny. The air in the scriptorium carried the dry, comfortable scent of aged parchment and the sharper tang of the dark ink I use daily. Sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, catching motes of dust that lazily drifted in the stillness. Here, amidst towering stacks of vellum and carefully bound codices, my world unfolded. My fingers, stained with indigo and sepia, traced the familiar curves of coastlines already charted, but my mind constantly drifted beyond their known edges. I meticulously corrected the slight inaccuracies in existing maps of the African littoral, using a fine quill to refine the delicate lines of bays and promontories. My family had served the crown as mapmakers for generations, a quiet legacy that instilled in me a deep respect for accuracy and an almost reverent awe for the unexplored. It was this reverence that secretly fueled my burning desire, a whispered ambition to chart the very sea route to India that had eluded so many. This quiet intensity was my element. I found a peculiar joy in the precise geometry of latitude and longitude, a language that, when spoken correctly, could unlock the secrets of the world. My gaze often lingered on the few fragmented charts I possessed, acquired through quiet dealings in the dockside taverns, scraps of knowledge from Arab navigators and earlier Portuguese voyages. These were not perfect, far from it, but they offered tantalizing glimpses of what lay beyond the familiar. The intricate markings, some written in Arabic script, spoke of vast distances and unknown shores. I would spend hours comparing them, the faint scratch of my stylus against vellum the only sound breaking the room's hush, trying to find patterns, to connect the dots that others had missed. My fascination with the stars was not merely academic, it was foundational to my craft. I spent many quiet evenings on the rooftop of my family's small house, the cool night air a welcome change from the day's work, calibrating my astrolabe. This instrument, a beautiful arrangement of brass rings and pointers, allowed me to measure the altitude of celestial bodies above the horizon. By observing the angle of the North Star, or later the celestial markers of the southern sky, I could determine our latitude, our distance north or south of the equator. It was a humbling science, connecting our small earthly existence to the grand celestial dance, and I took immense pride in the accuracy I could achieve. The existing maps, however, revealed a troubling truth. Latitude alone was not enough to navigate effectively across vast oceans. Longitude, our east-west position, remained a vexing puzzle. Without a reliable method to determine it, voyages were fraught with peril, prone to terrible miscalculations that could lead ships astray for weeks or forever. This fundamental flaw gnawed at me. I knew that if I could contribute to solving this puzzle, if I could help draw accurate charts that accounted for both latitude and longitude, then the true path to the east might finally be within our grasp. My mentor, a man whose hands bore the permanent marks of ink and sea salt, understood my quiet ambition. He had sailed on earlier expeditions, seen firsthand the vastness and unforgiving nature of the Atlantic. "João," he would say, his voice raspy, "the sea is a jealous mistress. She guards her secrets fiercely. These charts you refine, they are but whispers of truth. To truly know the ocean's face, you must feel its breath, its storms, its endless, indifferent blue." He spoke of the immense cost of equipping a ship, of the lives and fortunes risked on every venture, grounding my romantic notions in the harsh realities of finance and survival. This realism weighed heavily on me. While I dreamed of charting new worlds, my family's means were modest. My ambition was a luxury, one that required more than just knowledge. It demanded opportunity, and opportunity often came with a price. The thought of investing years, perhaps a lifetime, into a quest that could end in failure, leaving my family burdened and my own name tarnished, was a chilling one. It was a constant internal debate, the safe harbor of continuing the honored family tradition of refining existing maps versus the dangerous, uncharted waters of genuine exploration. Then an opportunity arose, a commission from a prominent trading company that dealt in West African goods. They needed their charts of the African coast updated, verified against new findings. It was not the grand voyage to India I yearned for, but it was a significant step, a tangible pathway into the world of active exploration. The task was daunting, demanding meticulous attention to detail and a willingness to venture into regions where existing knowledge was scant and often contradictory. I felt a familiar tug of war within me. The comfort of the scriptorium beckoned, its predictable quietude a stark contrast to the uncertainty of the open sea. Yet, the lure of the unknown, the chance to test my skills against the very challenges that plagued current charts, was irresistible. The trading company's offer was substantial, enough to provide for my family and perhaps fund further, bolder ventures. But the risks were equally immense. A miscalculation, a navigational error, could not only lead to financial ruin for the company, but also endanger the lives of the crew, and, more importantly for me, discredit my fledgling reputation before it had even truly begun. The sea offered discovery, but also demanded a heavy toll for any mistakes. After days of wrestling with the decision, I found myself accepting the commission. The path to the east, I reasoned, could only be forged by first mastering the lands closer to home. My family's reputation and my own deeply felt need to push the boundaries of our knowledge compelled me forward. This was not merely a job. It was the first necessary step on a much longer, more arduous journey. A journey that would take me beyond the familiar ink and parchment and onto the vast, unpredictable expanse of the Atlantic. The docks of Lisbon were a riot of activity, a stark contrast to the quiet sanctuary of my scriptorium. The air vibrated with the shouting of sailors, the creaking of ship timbers, and the sharp cries of gulls wheeling overhead. Rough-spun sailcloth, smelling faintly of tar and brine, was being hoisted onto the masts of the Estrela do Mar, the vessel assigned to my charting commission. The salty spray that kissed my face was invigorating, a potent reminder of the journey ahead. It was here, amidst the organized chaos of preparation, that I met the captain, a man whose weathered face and steady gaze spoke of countless voyages and hard-won experience. He was a pragmatic man, focused on the efficient loading of goods and the timely departure of his ship. He regarded my carefully rolled charts and polished instruments with a respectful but businesslike air. "We have cargo to deliver, young mapmaker," he stated, his voice a low rumble, "and markets waiting. Your charts are important, yes, but the currents and the winds wait for no man's perfect line. I nodded, understanding his perspective, but inside, a quiet determination solidified. My accuracy was paramount, not just for my own reputation, but for the safety of everyone aboard this ship and countless others who would one day follow. Weeks later, the familiar shores of Portugal faded into the distance, replaced by the endless, shifting blue of the Atlantic. The rhythm of the ship became my own, the gentle sway of the deck beneath my feet, the constant hum of the wind in the sails, and the vast star-dusted dome of the night sky above. I spent my days and nights diligently taking astronomical readings, using my quadrant to measure the angle of the sun at noon and the stars at night. These observations were my lifeline, my anchor in the immensity of the ocean, allowing me to plot our progress and ensure we stayed on course. However, I began to notice subtle discrepancies. The prevailing currents, though charted on our existing maps, seemed to deviate slightly from their expected paths, pushing us gently off course. Likewise, minor variations in the observed celestial movements, when compared against the most precise astronomical tables available, suggested that our existing navigational data was not as infallible as we had believed. Each small error, no matter how insignificant it seemed in isolation, represented a potential drift from our intended destination. The taste of the preserved rations, once merely monotonous, now seemed to carry the bitter hint of my growing unease. The voyage continued south, and the coastline of West Africa began to appear on the horizon, a band of vibrant green against the deep blue sea. The humidity intensified, clinging to my skin and making each breath a more conscious effort. The vegetation ashore was startlingly lush, a riot of colors I had never seen before, and the air pulsed with the unfamiliar calls of birds and insects, a constant, vibrant symphony that was entirely new to my ears. From the deck, I could glimpse the local populations, their lives unfolding in ways that were utterly alien to my own, a fascinating spectacle that I began to sketch with intense focus. I started to integrate my own observations with the fragmented charts I carried. Sketching the contours of the bays, marking the positions of prominent capes, and noting the types of trees that grew along the shore became my primary task. This direct engagement with the land, translating what I saw and measured into lines and symbols on parchment, brought a satisfaction far deeper than merely copying existing work. It felt like a true act of creation, of bringing new knowledge into existence, and I found myself increasingly drawn to this process of empirical discovery. However, the captain, ever mindful of the trading company's schedule, grew restless. "João," he said one evening, his brow furrowed, "your detailed work is commendable, but we are behind schedule. These stops to measure every cove, to sketch every sandbar, they add days to our journey, and time is coin." He was right, of course. Delays meant increased costs for provisions, higher wages for the crew, and missed opportunities in the markets. My ambitious plans for future voyages, which relied on the success and profitability of this current one, hung in the balance. I found myself caught between two competing demands: my professional integrity, which demanded meticulous accuracy, and the pragmatic pressures of commerce and expediency. To rush my charting would be to repeat the very errors that plagued our current maps, potentially leading to greater disasters down the line. Yet to refuse to yield to the captain's urgency could jeopardize not only this voyage, but also any future support for my endeavors. It was a difficult compromise, one that sat heavily in my gut. Ultimately, I chose to concede some ground, agreeing to streamline certain processes, to focus on the most critical coastal features, and reduce the time spent on less vital details. But I refused to sacrifice accuracy. I explained to the captain, as patiently as I could, that a slightly delayed but accurate chart was infinitely more valuable than a quickly completed one. The consequences of faulty maps, I emphasized, could be far more costly in lives and resources than any temporary delay. He grumbled, but he understood the inherent truth in my words, and we continued, a subtle tension now existing between us regarding the pace of our work. The voyage pushed further south, pushing the boundaries of our charted world. The familiar constellations of the north began to sink below the horizon, replaced by an entirely new celestial panorama. It was a disorienting experience, losing sight of the stars that have been my constant companions and finding myself under the glow of alien patterns. The sense of the sea also began to change, the dominant saltiness now occasionally mingled with a delicate, sweet perfume carried on the wind, hints of blooming jasmine from unseen lands far to the east. The coastline itself transformed. The lush greens of the equatorial regions gave way to more arid, windswept shores. The dry earth crunched underfoot when we made brief landings, and fine grit coated everything, including my skin and my precious instruments. I learned to seek shade whenever possible, each breath requiring a conscious effort in the dry warmth. Essential skills like identifying the subtle signs of hidden freshwater sources, a patch of greener vegetation, the flight path of certain birds, became as crucial to my survival and work as my knowledge of celestial navigation. During these landings, we made contact with local populations. Through a hired interpreter, a man whose tongue could bridge the linguistic divide, I engaged with individuals who possessed a wealth of knowledge about their own lands. They spoke of specific currents that ran counter to charted ones, of seasonal winds that could alter travel times, and of safe harbors hidden behind treacherous-looking reefs. I traded carefully prepared spices, a valuable commodity, for these invaluable insights. These exchanges were more than just transactions. They were moments of genuine learning, revealing that the land was not merely a blank space to be filled on a map, but a living entity with its own complex history and inhabitants, adding an ethical dimension to my work I had not fully considered before.
Then the sea unleashed its fury. A brutal storm descended upon us with terrifying speed, transforming the ocean into a heaving, enraged entity. The harsh mix of sounds, the deafening roar of the wind, and the thunderous crash of waves against the hull was overwhelming. The ship pitched and rolled violently, tossing us about like a child's toy. My immediate instinct was to secure my instruments and charts. I worked with frantic urgency, lashing down my precious tools, knowing that the storm's violence would undoubtedly have reshaped parts of the coastline, necessitating entirely new measurements and corrections. The fear that gripped me during those hours was primal, the raw power of the unknown now a tangible, terrifying presence. Upon our return to Lisbon for a brief respite, the task of incorporating the data gathered on the voyage became my singular focus. The scriptorium, which had once seemed confining, now felt like a haven where I could process the experiences of the past months. I spread out my newly drawn charts, comparing them against the older, less accurate versions. The process of projecting the curved surface of the Earth onto a flat sheet of parchment was a complex mathematical endeavor, requiring precise calculations to minimize distortion. I explained these techniques to my apprentices, detailing the use of spherical trigonometry and projection methods, all while feeling the weight of the royal patron's expectations for further progress. The desire to map the sea route to India, which had been a quiet ember, now burned with an intense, almost feverish glow. The success of this African charting expedition, though challenging, had proven the value of my methods and garnered commendation. This recognition only amplified the pressure from my patrons to push further, to aim higher. Yet, as I meticulously inked new lines onto the parchment, I could not shake a growing sense of unease. My maps, I understood, were not merely scientific documents. They were tools that would facilitate trade, yes, but also, I now recognized with increasing clarity, tools that could enable conquest and exploitation. As preparations began for a more ambitious expedition, one that would venture deeper into the southern reaches of the African continent and perhaps even further east, I found myself grappling with the implications of my work. The exchanges I had with the coastal peoples, their wisdom and their vulnerability weighed on my conscience. I had witnessed the casual brutality of some traders, the way certain individuals were treated as little more than cargo. This burgeoning awareness created a deep internal conflict between my insatiable scientific curiosity and a growing, unsettling question about the ultimate purpose of the knowledge I was so diligently uncovering. The journey into the East proved to be an entirely new level of challenge. We navigated through complex archipelagos, islands scattered like jewels across the vast ocean, where local knowledge and celestial observations often presented conflicting information. The estimation of longitude, even with the improved methods I had developed, remained a persistent obstacle. The tools available at the time, primarily astronomical clocks that were prone to error at sea, made precise east-west positioning a constant struggle, fueling my desire for even more accurate timekeeping and navigational devices. The air in the bustling foreign ports, however, offered a welcome change, rich with the exotic scents of spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, a sensory reward for enduring the open sea. Years had now passed since I first began my meticulous work in the Lisbon scriptorium. The eager young apprentice was gone, replaced by a man whose resilience had been forged in the isolation of long voyages, whose understanding of human endurance had been grimly earned, and who possessed a quiet wisdom gained from both life and death played out on the ocean stage. The psychological toll of these years was evident in the lines etched around my eyes, and the way my gaze often drifted to the distant horizon, a habit born from endless hours scanning for land or navigating by stars. The memory of lost shipmates, men whose laughter and stories were now just echoes in my mind, was a constant reminder of the fragility of life at sea and a deeper appreciation for the interconnectedness of the world I was helping to map. Now an experienced and respected navigator, I look back on the lines I have drawn, the countless hours spent in quiet contemplation and arduous travel. I understand the profound impact of my maps, how they have not only opened new trade routes and facilitated exploration, but have irrevocably altered humanity's perception of its own world. The ethical considerations of my profession, the delicate balance between the thrill of discovery and the responsibility for its consequences, are never far from my thoughts. My final reflections are always drawn to the endless horizon, to that enduring human drive to chart the unknown, a drive that has shaped every facet of my life and transformed me into the man I am today. The charting of the world had tested me in ways I was only beginning to grasp. The polished brass of my astrolabe felt cool and familiar under my fingertips, a comforting weight that grounded me amidst the anxieties of what lay ahead. I spent long hours hunched over my workbench, the faint scent of lamp oil mingling with the dry aroma of old parchment. My father had often said that a cartographer's true work began not on the paper, but in understanding the celestial bodies that guided us across the vast, often unforgiving ocean. This dedication to precision was a duty I felt keenly, a testament to the generations of mapmakers in my family who had meticulously etched the known world onto vellum. My ambition to chart a viable route to the riches of the East was a quiet fire within me, but the practical steps to achieve it often felt overwhelming, like deciphering an ancient coded message. The astrolabe, a marvel of interwoven rings and sighting vanes, allowed me to measure the height of stars above the horizon.
By comparing these measurements to known star positions, I could determine our latitude, our position north or south of the equator. This instrument, alongside the quadrant, a simpler device for measuring angles, formed the bedrock of my understanding of navigation. Yet the charts I pored over, compiled from travelers' tales and fragmented Arab manuscripts, often contained alarming discrepancies. These inaccuracies, particularly in the portrayal of coastlines and the calculated positions of landmarks, represented not just errors on paper, but potential hazards for ships at sea, leading to lost voyages and, far worse, lost lives.
My mentor, Master Rodrigo, his hands gnarled like ancient oak branches, would often sigh as we examined these flawed documents. He had sailed on many voyages in his youth and understood the unforgiving nature of the sea and the immense power of accurate information. "Joe," he would say, his voice raspy with age and the sea air that still clung to him, "a single degree of error can send you leagues off course. These new lands, they are not forgiving of ignorance. The investment of a king or a merchant is immense, and a flawed map means not just lost profit, but ruin and despair for many." His words painted a stark picture of the stakes involved, reinforcing the importance of my painstaking work and the heavy burden of responsibility I carried. The limitations of our current knowledge gnawed at me, fueling a restless energy that kept me awake long after the scriptorium lamps were extinguished. I found myself constantly cross-referencing star charts, consulting astronomical tables, and performing complex calculations to refine even the smallest details. The sheer scale of the undertaking to accurately chart vast stretches of coastline previously known only through rumor felt immense. It was a challenge that tested the limits of my skills and my courage. The thought of sailing into the unknown, armed with instruments and calculations that were still imperfect, was a daunting prospect. This constant striving for accuracy, for an understanding that transcended mere conjecture, began to shape my understanding of ambition itself. It was not enough to simply dream of discovery. One had to build the very foundation upon which such dreams could be realized. This meant dedicating myself to the meticulous calibration of my tools, the rigorous testing of my methods, and the unwavering pursuit of knowledge, however incremental the progress. The ambition to reach India remained a guiding star, but it was tempered by the immediate need to master the craft of map-making, to ensure that the lines I drew would lead safely, not to peril. The weight of these thoughts pressed upon me as I worked, the precision required for each measurement, a physical manifestation of the mental discipline demanded by my craft. I practiced sighting the angle of the North Star, its steadfast presence a crucial reference point in the night sky. The process involved aligning the alidade, a movable ruler with sighting vanes, with the star, and then reading the angle indicated on the graduated arc of the astrolabe. This single observation, repeated under different stars, offered a pathway to mapping the world with unprecedented accuracy, a prospect that filled me with a quiet thrill. My mentor's counsel regarding the financial realities of expeditions was equally sobering. He spoke of the vast sums required to outfit a ship, to provision it for months at sea, and to compensate the crew. These ventures, he had once explained, gesturing with his ink-stained fingers towards a half-finished chart of the Atlantic, are not undertaken lightly. A single failed voyage can bankrupt a family or an entire trading house. Your skill, João, your accuracy, is your most valuable asset, and it is also your greatest risk. For if your charts are flawed, the cost of your knowledge is exceedingly high.
The very act of refining these celestial measurements felt like a personal struggle against the vastness of the unknown. Each corrected calculation, each more accurate reading, was a small victory wrested from the chaotic embrace of the sea and the sky. I felt a deep connection to the ancient astronomers and mathematicians whose work formed the basis of my own, a lineage of seekers who had strived to impose order on the cosmos and, by extension, on the world we inhabited. This intellectual inheritance was a source of both pride and immense responsibility. The limitations of the existing charts were a constant source of professional frustration. I observed how coastal shapes were often distorted, distances between ports exaggerated or minimized, and currents, the invisible rivers of the ocean, were rarely indicated with any certainty. These inaccuracies were not simply academic flaws. They represented tangible dangers. A ship relying on a misplotted coastline could easily run aground on hidden reefs or become lost in unpredictable waters, a fate I was determined to help avert through my dedication to precise cartography.
Therefore, I dedicated myself to the rigorous study of these astronomical tools, spending countless hours practicing their use under the clear Lisbon skies. I learned to account for the slight variations in celestial positions due to the time of year, and to correct for the dip of the horizon, a phenomenon caused by the curvature of the Earth. This meticulous process, though tedious, was essential. It was through this unwavering commitment to understanding the mechanics of celestial navigation that I hoped to transcend the limitations of the fragmented knowledge that had come before me, and to contribute something truly valuable to the art of mapmaking. The potential for failure, as my mentor had so vividly described, was a shadow that accompanied my ambition. The significant investment required for expeditions meant that any error on my part could have far-reaching consequences, impacting not only my own career, but also the livelihoods and safety of many others. This understanding made my work feel profoundly important, imbuing my calculations with a weight that extended far beyond the parchment before me. I felt the tangible connection between the abstract beauty of geometry and the very real dangers faced by sailors navigating the world's oceans. I understood that my ambition to chart the route to India was a grand aspiration, one that would require more than just theoretical knowledge. It would demand practical experience, a willingness to confront the unpredictable nature of the sea, and the courage to venture into territories yet unmapped. The calibration of my astrolabe and quadrant was not merely an academic exercise. It was the preparation for the real challenges that lay ahead, a way to build confidence in the tools that would guide me through uncharted waters. The conversation with Master Rodrigo, though brief, was a potent reminder of the immense risks involved in maritime exploration and the critical role of accurate cartography in mitigating those dangers. His lived experience lent a gravitas to his words, emphasizing that the seemingly abstract calculations I performed had direct, life-altering consequences. This reinforcement of the professional stakes, combined with the deep personal desire to advance the boundaries of known geography, solidified my resolve to pursue this path, despite the inherent perils. This encounter with the foundational tools of my profession lingered in my thoughts as I continued to refine their accuracy.
The invitation arrived on a crisp morning, carried by a runner from the offices of the Casa de Guinea, the trading company that financed many of our voyages. My hands, accustomed to the smooth, worn surfaces of my charting tools, felt a tremor of apprehension as I broke the wax seal. It was a commission, a formal request to accompany one of their ships, the Estrela do Mar, to the West African coast. My task was not merely to sail, but to survey, to verify the existing charts,
which, as I had learned, were little more than educated guesses stitched together from fragmented reports. This was a step toward my secret ambition, the grand aspiration to chart the true course to India. But it also presented a stark challenge, a crossroads that demanded careful consideration of the risks involved. The weight of this opportunity settled upon me as I reread the parchment. For years, I had toiled in the quiet sanctuary of the scriptorium, my world confined to the comforting scent of ink and aged paper, the precise click of dividers, and the subtle whisper of quill on vellum. Now, the vast, unpredictable canvas of the Atlantic beckoned, a place where my skills would be tested not by the steady hand of a mentor, but by the capricious moods of the sea and the unforgiving realities of distant lands. My family's modest means meant that any failure would have dire consequences, a risk I had to balance against the immense potential for discovery and the very real possibility of never seeing Lisbon's familiar shores again. I found myself torn. A part of me, the scholar, content with the familiar, urged caution, suggesting that further refinement of my existing knowledge would be a safer path. Yet the allure of the unknown, the chance to fill those blank spaces on the charts with my own observations, proved too potent to ignore. The prospect of adding even a small section of accurate coastline to our understanding of the world stirred a deep longing within me, a cartographer's hunger to bring order to chaos. This commission, though daunting, represented the only viable bridge between my current quiet life and the grand voyages I dreamed of. And after many hours of internal debate, I knew I had to accept. This was my path forward. Preparations for the voyage commenced with a flurry of activity, drawing me from the hushed confines of my study into the vibrant heart of Lisbon's harbor. The docks thrummed with a life I had only previously imagined, a chaotic symphony of shouting sailors, creaking timbers, and the insistent cries of gulls circling overhead. Rough woven sailcloth, smelling faintly of brine and pitch, was loaded onto the Estrela do Mar, its sturdy timbers seeming to groan with anticipation. The salty spray from the restless water kissed my face, a bracing welcome from the vast expanse that lay before us. And I met the captain, a man whose weathered face and steady gaze spoke of countless voyages and a deep understanding of the ocean's temper. As we finally sailed beyond the protective embrace of the Tagus River, the sheer immensity of the Atlantic became my constant companion. Weeks blurred into a relentless rhythm of watchfulness and calculation. I meticulously calibrated my astrolabe and quadrant each dawn and dusk, seeking to plot our course by the celestial bodies. However, subtle, almost imperceptible inconsistencies in their movements, coupled with unexpected shifts in the prevailing currents, began to introduce small errors into my calculations. The constant rocking of the ship made every measurement a challenge, and the taste of the dwindling hard biscuit and salted meat became a stark reminder of the limited resources available to us. Our arrival on the West African coast was an immersion into a world of overwhelming sensory input. The humidity was immediate, a damp blanket that clung to my skin. And the greens of the vegetation were of a startling, vibrant intensity I had never witnessed before. A constant, vibrant soundscape composed of unfamiliar bird calls and the incessant hum of insects filled the air around us. From the relative safety of the ship, I observed the local populations from a distance, their ways of life a fascinating contrast to anything I knew. I began sketching the sinuous lines of the coastline, carefully integrating my own observations with the sparse, often inaccurate information on the charts, finding a profound satisfaction in this direct engagement with the land. The trading company's captain, a man whose focus remained steadfastly on profit margins, grew visibly impatient with my methodical approach. He urged me to expedite my charting, prioritizing speed over the meticulous detail I deemed essential.
This presented a difficult dilemma. Delays, I understood, meant increased costs for the company and could jeopardize future funding for my more ambitious projects. The pressure to concede time was immense, a constant undercurrent of tension between us. I found myself wrestling with this demand, knowing that any inaccuracy, any hurried judgment could lead to disaster for future mariners. I chose to stand firm on the accuracy, even if it meant a longer stay, understanding that faulty maps were a betrayal of the trust placed in me and could have severe repercussions for everyone who relied on them. The voyage continued southward, pushing us further down the African coastline into regions largely absent from our existing maps. I noted a distinct change in the scent of the sea. The familiar brine was now often tinged with exotic perfumes, hints of blooming jasmine carried on the wind from unseen shorelines. We navigated treacherous reefs that lay hidden just beneath the surface, their jagged forms a constant threat, and charted unfamiliar coastal formations that seemed to rise abruptly from the water. A sense of growing isolation began to settle in as the familiar patterns of the northern stars slowly vanished from view, replaced by constellations that felt entirely alien, and each night the task of finding my bearings felt more profound. The landscape along the shores began to transform, shifting to arid, windswept stretches where the earth itself seemed to crack with thirst. The gritty particles of dry soil clung to my skin, a constant reminder of the parched environment. I found myself seeking any available shade whenever we made landfall, each breath requiring a conscious effort in the pervasive dryness. During this time, I learned to observe the subtle signs that indicated the presence of fresh water, a crucial skill that deepened my understanding of survival and the intricate relationship between the land and its scarce water sources. The unwelcome taste of brackish water became a frequent companion, a stark contrast to the pure water I had always taken for granted. Our encounters with local populations offered invaluable insights that no chart could ever convey. Through an interpreter, I engaged with individuals who possessed a profound knowledge of the region, understanding the ebb and flow of local currents, predicting weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, and identifying safe harbors hidden from view. I exchanged carefully prepared spices, fragrant and precious, for their wisdom, realizing that the land was not merely a blank space to be filled on parchment, but a living entity with its own stories and inhabitants. This interaction began to awaken a sense of ethical complexity within me, a dawning awareness of the responsibility that came with charting these territories and the lives intertwined with them. A brutal storm descended upon us with terrifying speed, testing the ship and its crew to their absolute limits. The harsh mix of sounds was overwhelming, the deafening roar of the wind and the thunderous crash of waves against the hull, as the vessel was tossed about like a child's toy. Amidst the chaos, I worked tirelessly to secure my instruments and my precious charts, knowing that the storm's fury had undoubtedly reshaped coastal features, rendering previous measurements potentially obsolete and demanding new observations. The experience left me shaken to my core, the fear of the unknown now a palpable presence that lingered long after the tempest subsided, a stark reminder of our vulnerability against nature's might. Upon our return to Lisbon, a brief respite allowed me to meticulously incorporate the data gathered from the voyage onto my charts. I painstakingly worked through the complex mathematical principles required to project the curved surface of the Earth onto the flat plane of parchment, ensuring the utmost accuracy in every line and marking. The commendations I received from the trading company were welcome, but they were quickly overshadowed by the increasing pressure from royal patrons. They urged me to push further, to venture into even more unknown territories, and the desire to map the sea route to India burned more fiercely than ever, a guiding star in my professional life. As preparations began for a more ambitious expedition, I found myself grappling with the broader implications of my work. My maps, I realized, were not merely tools for navigation. They were instruments that facilitated trade, exploration, and, inevitably, conquest. The weight of responsibility for the knowledge I uncovered began to press upon me. Witnessing firsthand the often harsh realities of the maritime trade, particularly the exploitation of certain peoples for profit, fueled an internal conflict. My scientific curiosity warred with a growing sense of unease about the ultimate purpose of my charting, a disquieting questioning of the impact of my endeavors. The expedition pushed us eastward, leading us into the intricate labyrinth of archipelagos where the challenges of navigation intensified. Local knowledge and celestial observations were vital, yet often contradictory, making the task of precise charting even more demanding. I struggled with estimating longitude, a persistent hurdle given the limited tools available, a challenge that only fueled my desire to find more accurate methods of measurement. Despite the difficulties, the rich sense of exotic spices encountered in the bustling foreign ports offered a welcome sensory change, a vibrant tapestry of aromas that contrasted sharply with the endless expanse of the open sea. Years had now passed since my first voyage, and the eager apprentice had been transformed. I reflected on the profound changes within me, the resilience forged in the crucible of isolation, the grim understanding of human endurance gained from countless trials, and the quiet wisdom that came from witnessing both life and death at sea. The psychological toll of these long voyages was undeniable. The memories of lost shipmates and the stark realities of life aboard a vessel at the mercy of the elements had left their mark. Yet these experiences also brought a deeper appreciation for the interconnectedness of the world I was busy mapping, a realization of how even the smallest detail on my charts could have far-reaching consequences. Now an experienced and respected navigator, I looked back on a career defined by the lines I had drawn. I understood the profound impact of my maps, how they had opened new trade routes, fueled exploration, and irrevocably altered the global perception of our world. Contemplating the ethical considerations of my profession, I recognized the delicate balance between the thirst for discovery and its often unforeseen consequences. My final thoughts turned towards the endless horizon, that perpetual invitation to the unknown, and the enduring human drive to chart the uncharted, a drive that had shaped me and would continue to shape the world for generations to come. I had seen firsthand how the careful rendering of even a small coastal detail could alter the course of history. The docks of Lisbon presented a vibrant tapestry of organized chaos, a stark departure from the quiet, focused world of the scriptorium I knew so well. Rough woven sailcloth, stiff with salt and sea brine, brushed against my legs as I made my way through the throng. The constant creak of timbers, a symphony of shipwrights at work, and vessels shifting at their moorings filled the air, accompanied by the sharp, insistent cries of countless gulls circling overhead, their calls a familiar soundtrack to any port. The salty spray from the nearby Tagus River kissed my face, a cool, invigorating sensation after weeks spent indoors with only the dry scent of parchment for company. I felt the rough texture of ropes coiled high on masts and saw the weathered faces of sailors, their skin etched by sun and sea. My commission from the Casa da Guiné, the Portuguese trading company responsible for commerce along the West African coast, had brought me here to prepare for my first true voyage. It was a chance to test the charts I had so painstakingly refined,
to see if the delicate lines and calculated distances held true against the vast blue expanse of the Atlantic that now beckoned. This was the tangible beginning of my ambition to map the sea route to India, a dream that had grown from whispered tales and fragmented maps within the scriptorium's quiet walls. The sheer scale of the undertaking, however, was only now beginning to truly settle upon me.
I located the appointed vessel, its hull sturdy and weathered, a testament to many voyages past. Its captain, a man whose face seemed carved from driftwood, and whose eyes held the distant look of one who had seen many horizons, greeted me with a curt nod. He was a pragmatic soul, his attention focused on the practicalities of cargo and crew, and I sensed a quiet impatience beneath his gruff exterior. The ship was a hive of activity. Sailors were busily securing barrels, checking rigging, and stowing supplies, their movements efficient and practiced. Each task seemed to contribute to the immense endeavor of setting sail into the unknown. The sheer volume of preparation was astonishing. Workers paused frequently to drink water from leather skins, their faces damp with sweat from the exertion of loading heavy crates. I watched as they meticulously coiled ropes, their rough textures familiar to my hands, and secured heavy anchors with strong, thick ropes. The air around the ship hummed with a focused energy, a stark contrast to the contemplative quiet of my studies. This was the tangible reality of exploration, the ground-level work that made the grand designs of cartography possible. My own preparations involved ensuring my navigational instruments were in perfect order. I checked the smooth, polished surface of my astrolabe, a tool used to measure the angle of celestial bodies above the horizon, and my quadrant, another instrument for celestial navigation, ensuring its markings were precise. These were the anchors of my craft, the only reliable guides when the familiar landmarks of land vanished behind us. The limited rations, mostly hard biscuits and salted meat, were being loaded with care, each sack representing a portion of sustenance for the arduous journey ahead. Observing the final moments before departure, I felt a profound sense of transition. The familiar scent of wood smoke from the city mingled with the sharp, invigorating tang of the sea. The sounds of the docks, the shouts of men, the creak of pulleys, the gentle lapping of water against the hull formed a complex chorus that spoke of movement and adventure. I saw families saying farewell to sailors, their faces a mix of pride and apprehension, a common sight that always stirred a complex emotion within me. My previous focus had been on the theoretical, on the precise placement of lines on parchment, guided by the calculations of astronomers and the fragmented accounts of earlier travelers. Now, however, I was to immerse myself in the very reality those lines represented. The vastness of the Atlantic, stretching out before us, held an undeniable allure, a promise of discovery that dwarfed the confines of any scriptorium. It was a world of ever-changing currents and unpredictable winds, a canvas upon which my maps would be tested. As the ship finally pulled away from the shore, the bustling sounds of Lisbon gradually faded, replaced by the more consistent rhythm of the waves against the hull. The familiar, cool touch of sea spray on my skin became a constant companion. I found myself contemplating the immense responsibility of translating the fluid, ever-changing reality of the ocean into static, precise lines on a map. How could one truly capture the essence of such a dynamic world with ink and parchment? My cartographer's instruments had led me to this unexpected moment of departure. The relentless rhythm of the sea had become a constant companion, a swaying cradle that sometimes offered comfort and other times a jarring reminder of our distance from solid ground. Weeks had blurred into a ceaseless cycle of astronomical observation and the meticulous recording of our passage. I carefully calibrated my astrolabe each day, its polished brass cool against my fingers, to mark the sun's arc and the stars' slow march across the night sky. These celestial guides were our only reliable compass. Yet even they seemed to whisper of subtle inconsistencies, small variances that began to prick at my confidence in the charts we carried. Prevailing currents, invisible forces that shaped the ocean's vast expanse, proved more elusive than the predictable paths of the stars. Our careful calculations, honed by years of study and the quiet scriptorium, were meeting the unpredictable reality of the Atlantic's deep, unseen flows. It felt like trying to capture the wind in a jar. The harder I tried to pin down our exact position, the more the variables seemed to shift. This growing discrepancy between our projected course and our actual drift was a source of deep frustration, a quiet gnawing at the edges of my resolve.
The limited rations, a monotonous mix of hardtack and salted meat, offered little comfort against the growing unease. The taste of this dry, unyielding sustenance seemed to permeate everything, a constant reminder of our isolation. Each day, as the ship pitched and rolled, I felt the strain on my body, a deep weariness that settled into my bones. It was a stark contrast to the studious stillness of Lisbon, where the scent of ink and beeswax had been my world. Here, the salty tang of the ocean was ever present, carried on the wind that filled our sails and pushed us further into the unknown. We had reached the region known as the Green Coast, a name that aptly described the vibrant, almost overwhelming verdancy that met our eyes. The humidity was a constant, palpable presence, clinging to my skin and making each breath require a conscious effort. It was a world saturated with unfamiliar sounds, the sharp, insistent calls of unseen birds echoing from dense foliage, the constant hum of insects forming a vibrant, layered soundscape that never truly faded. This immersive sensory experience was a profound change from the carefully controlled environment of the Mapmaker's workshop. From the ship, we observed the coastal inhabitants from a distance, a different people living lives shaped by this rich yet challenging environment. Their small settlements dotted the shoreline, and their ways of life, glimpsed from the deck, were unlike anything I had ever imagined. I began the painstaking work of sketching the coastline, translating the fragmented knowledge on our existing charts with my own direct observations. Each headland, each subtle curve of the shore was a piece of a puzzle, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in fitting them together. During this time, the captain, a gruff man whose weathered face spoke of countless voyages, began to express his impatience. He was a man of action, his focus fixed on the trading opportunities ahead, and he viewed our meticulous charting as a costly delay. The captain's pressure to move faster, to prioritize the swiftness of trade over the thoroughness of accuracy, created a difficult situation. He reminded me that every day we spent refining our maps was a day lost for commerce, a direct hit to our financial viability. I found myself torn between the captain's urgent demands and the deep-seated principles of my profession. The thought of returning with inaccurate charts, of leaving others to navigate based on my flawed work, was a burden I could not easily dismiss. The potential for immense discovery was tempered by the very real consequences of error, not just for my own reputation, but for the lives and fortunes of those who would follow. This internal struggle was a familiar one, a constant negotiation between ambition and responsibility. Because of this pressure, I made the difficult choice to concede some time, agreeing to move our anchorage more frequently. However, I was resolute that accuracy would not be compromised. I spent hours on deck, even as the crew prepared to weigh anchor, taking last-minute readings, trying to capture every nuance of the shifting coastline. The captain grumbled, but he saw the intensity in my work, perhaps recognizing that a flawed map was worse than a delayed one, a hard lesson many had learned to their sorrow.
Building on this, I began to notice patterns in the land itself that seemed to influence the currents more than the stars alone. Certain bays seemed to create eddies, and the discharge of rivers appeared to subtly alter the water's flow along the coast. This was new knowledge, an understanding that the sea was not merely a blank canvas, but a complex system influenced by the very land it embraced. It was a realization that shifted my perspective on the cartographer's role, moving beyond celestial mechanics to a more grounded appreciation of the Earth's influence. While this meticulous work continued, a sailor named Tomas, who hailed from the poorer quarters of Lisbon, shared an unusual piece of information. He spoke of a particular type of seaweed seen floating in dense patches that local fishermen claimed indicated treacherous, unseen sandbars. He'd learned this from an old mariner who swore by its accuracy, a piece of folk wisdom I had initially dismissed, but now reconsidered with growing interest. It was a quirky detail, a hint of practical knowledge passed down through generations, far removed from the geometric precision of my instruments.
This practical knowledge sparked a lively debate amongst the crew. Some scoffed at Tomas's seaweed lore, clinging to the authority of celestial navigation as practiced by scholars like myself. Others, however, were more open, perhaps remembering times when their own intuition or the advice of experienced non-scholarly sailors had saved them. This ongoing scholarly debate between empirical science and traditional, often unwritten knowledge was fascinating to witness from within the ranks of the ship's company, a microcosm of broader discussions back home. Furthermore, the taste of fresh water, when we were fortunate enough to find it, became a revelation, a sharp, clean contrast to the brackish, metallic tang of the ship's reserves. We learned to look for specific vegetation patterns, for certain bird behaviors that indicated a landward source. These were vital survival skills, deeply practical lessons that the scriptorium's diagrams could never fully convey. The land was not simply a space to be mapped, but a living entity with its own intricate rules for sustenance. As we navigated further south, the familiar constellations of the north began to disappear below the horizon, replaced by alien patterns of stars I had only seen in diagrams. This feeling of growing isolation was profound, a stark reminder of how far we had ventured from home. The sky itself seemed to be transforming, and with it, the reliable anchors I had always depended upon. It was a subtle but deeply unsettling shift in my perception of the world's spatial order, a challenge to my very understanding of orientation. The knowledge I'd gained about the subtle interplay between land and sea and the practical wisdom of the common sailor felt both heavy and precious. The scent of the sea air, so different from the dry dust of Lisbon's scriptoriums, now mingled with the damp earth of this new coast. As we anchored offshore, I peered towards the land, my eyes adjusting to the vibrant greens that seemed to swallow the familiar blues and browns of my charts. The humidity clung to me like a second skin, making each breath feel fuller, richer, yet demanding a greater effort. This was the green coast, and its reality was far more overwhelming than any drawing could convey. The sounds alone were a constant chorus, the sharp cries of unseen birds, a symphony of chirps and rustles from the dense vegetation, all blending into a vibrant soundscape that promised untold discoveries. Observing the shore from the ship's deck, I saw the local people moving about their daily tasks. Their lives unfolded with a rhythm dictated by the sun and the land, a stark contrast to the hurried routines of the port cities I knew. Through my spyglass, I could make out small fishing boats being expertly handled and figures tending to crops that grew in abundance. It was clear their ways of life were deeply connected to this environment, a connection I was only beginning to understand. This organic way of living, so different from the rigid structures of European society, offered a profound new perspective on human existence and the world itself.
The initial task was to meticulously sketch the coastline, a process that involved careful observation and comparison with the incomplete maps I carried. With my charcoal and parchment, I began to translate the curve of the shore, the placement of inlets, and the rise of distant hills into tangible lines and shading. Each stroke of my pen was an effort to reconcile the fragmented knowledge of the past with the undeniable reality before me. This direct engagement with the land was immensely satisfying, a form of discovery that felt both ancient and entirely new. However, the ship's captain, a practical man named Duarte, grew increasingly anxious about our progress. He saw my careful charting as a delay, a luxurious expenditure of time when precious cargo awaited profitable exchange further along the coast. He would often stand at the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon, a subtle frown etched on his brow as he watched me at my work. His focus was on the destination, on the swift completion of our trading mission, which meant less emphasis on the precise mapping of every cove and sandbar. Duarte voiced his concerns one warm afternoon as I worked below deck. "João," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "we must make haste. The opportunities for trade do not wait for the perfect line on parchment. These people here, they know the routes, they know the harbors. We can rely on their guidance to move us along." His words carried the weight of commercial necessity, a pressure I understood all too well, for my own ambitions depended on the success of these ventures. I found myself torn. My professional commitment demanded accuracy, the creation of charts that would serve future voyages reliably. Yet the captain's impatience reflected the economic realities that funded these expeditions. To falter here, to be seen as overly slow or inefficient, could jeopardize my reputation and, more importantly, the future funding for my greater quest to chart the passage to India. The thought of such a setback gnawed at me, making the captain's pragmatic approach seem undeniably sensible from a certain angle. After a period of quiet contemplation, I chose to compromise, though not on accuracy itself. I would allocate specific hours for the captain's prioritized tasks, ensuring the ship's departure and movements were on schedule. During these times, I would rely on the crew's quick sketches and the captain's own rough observations, noting them down as best I could. However, my dedicated hours for detailed charting would remain, protected and fiercely guarded. This balance, I reasoned, would satisfy the immediate commercial needs while preserving the integrity of my work, a delicate dance between expediency and exactitude. The following days saw a shift in our interactions. I would assist Duarte in preparing the ship for departure, ensuring sails were set and anchors weighed with practiced efficiency. Then, once the vessel was underway and its course charted for the day by the navigator, I would return to my task. This meant working long hours, often by the light of a swaying lantern, scrutinizing my sketches and comparing them with the subtle shifts in the coastline we passed. The effort was immense, but the sense of accomplishment grew with each completed section of the new chart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I found myself thinking about the vastness of what remained unknown. These charted coastlines, so vital to our voyages, were merely fragments of a much larger picture. The question of how all these pieces would eventually fit together, of how these detailed maps would ultimately contribute to a more complete understanding of the world, occupied my thoughts. It was a humbling realization of the scale of the task before me. The rhythm of this compromise settled into our daily routine. The captain seemed content with the visible progress, and I was able to continue my essential work. Yet, the inherent tension of the situation remained. Each day was a careful calculation, a weighing of immediate demands against the long-term vision. The subtle scent of drying herbs from the ship's stores, mixed with the ever-present salt of the sea, became the backdrop to this constant negotiation. This journey along the green coast had brought a new dimension to my understanding of cartography. It was not merely about transposing observations onto parchment, but about a profound engagement with the land itself and the people who inhabited it. The direct experience of its humidity, its vibrant life, and the complexities of its human inhabitants offered a richer, more complete picture than any fragmented map could ever provide. This exploration had sharpened my senses and broadened my perspective on the world's vastness. The familiar scent of drying fish and tar replaced the fainter, saltier tang of the open ocean as our vessel neared the coast. Captain Mendez, his face etched by 1,000 sunrises and storms, paced the quarterdeck, his gaze fixed on the coastline. He had grown tired of the leisurely pace dictated by my careful observations. "João," he called out, his voice rough as barnacles. "The guild expects us to be at São Jorge de Mina by the next moon. We cannot linger here, charting every ripple and tide pool." His words carried the weight of commercial expectation, a stark reminder that my pursuit of perfect knowledge often clashed with the urgent demands of profit. My instruments lay spread on a sturdy wooden table, catching the afternoon light. I ran a finger over the smooth brass of the astrolabe, its intricate markings a testament to human ingenuity. Yet even these marvels offered only a snapshot, a moment in time. The currents of the Atlantic, as I was learning, were a living, shifting entity, not mere lines on parchment. Captain Mendez's impatience stemmed from a practical concern. Each day spent here meant lost opportunities for trade, for acquiring ivory and gold. He saw my work as a hindrance, a delaying tactic, while I saw it as the bedrock of future ventures, a promise of safer passage for those who followed. I found myself caught between these two powerful currents, the captain's urgent need for speed and my own deep-seated commitment to accuracy. He spoke of the company's investment, the money poured into this expedition, and how my meticulous methods were bleeding them dry. "A good enough map will suffice, João," he insisted, his tone softening slightly, as if to placate a wayward child. "We are merchants, not philosophers. Our purpose is to reach the markets, not to perfect the heavens." His practicality was undeniable, but his disregard for the potential consequences of incomplete charts troubled me deeply. This internal struggle was not new, but here, on this coast, it felt amplified. The African landmass, rendered in broad, often inaccurate strokes on the charts I had studied in Lisbon, was revealing itself as a complex, nuanced reality. The indigenous peoples, whose villages dotted the shoreline, possessed knowledge of these waters far exceeding any written record. A few days prior, while the ship was anchored to replenish our water stores, I had traded a length of fine linen for a detailed drawing etched onto a piece of cured animal hide. It depicted channels and sandbars unknown to our navigators, a treasure trove of information that made my existing charts feel woefully incomplete. The artist, a man whose name I learned was Kwesi through gestures and a shared pot of stew, showed me how the tides shaped the very landscape, creating temporary islands and shifting channels. He described how the stars, though familiar, appeared at different points in the sky depending on the season, a subtle variation that could lead a ship astray. This was knowledge born not from calculation, but from generations of living and observing, a different kind of expertise that I, with my tools and tables, was only beginning to grasp. My mind raced, trying to reconcile his oral traditions and visual depictions with the geometric certainty I sought.
Captain Mendez, however, saw little value in such exchanges. He preferred the predictability of coin and cargo. He worried that my fascination with local lore would further delay our departure, potentially jeopardizing the valuable cargo of pepper we had already acquired at a neighboring port. The Portuguese crown rewards progress, João, not contemplation, he reminded me, his voice losing its earlier gentleness. He spoke of the king's ambition, of the need to establish Portugal's dominance along this coast, and how delays played into the hands of our rivals. The pressure to complete my task quickly and return was immense, a constant hum beneath the surface of our daily interactions. I understood his perspective, truly I did. The funds for this voyage had been substantial, and the company expected a return on its investment. My own family's modest means meant that my success here was not just a professional matter, but a matter of familial pride and future security. Yet the thought of producing maps that might lead other ships into peril, that might cause the loss of lives and precious cargo, gnawed at me. I remembered the fate of a small caravel that had run aground on the shoals south of here, just weeks before our arrival. Its timbers splintered, its crew scattered. The captain blamed inaccurate charts. It was in that moment, observing the worried faces of the surviving sailors being brought aboard our ship, that I made my decision. I would not compromise the accuracy of my work. However, I also recognized that outright refusal would be seen as insubordination and would likely end my burgeoning career before it truly began. I would concede some time, perhaps an extra day or two, to appease the captain, but I would not abandon the rigorous process of verification. I explained to Captain Mendez that few more hours spent charting a particularly complex inlet would actually save us time in the long run by ensuring we did not attempt to navigate treacherous shallows. He grumbled, shaking his head, but the logic, presented as a path to efficiency rather than pure scientific pursuit, seemed to placate him somewhat. He agreed to a single extra day, warning me that this was my final chance to prove the value of my careful methods. The next day, under the brilliant sky, I worked with a renewed sense of purpose, my quill flying across the parchment. I carefully incorporated the insights from Quasi's drawing, overlaying it with my own astronomical calculations and the readings from my sounding lead. It was a complex dance, a fusion of different forms of knowledge, and for the first time, I felt a true sense of discovery, of creating something genuinely new. The process of integrating the local knowledge was fascinating. Quasi's drawing, rendered in simple, bold lines, depicted the coastal waters with an intimate understanding of their ebb and flow. He used markers that reflected the natural world, a cluster of stones indicating a safe anchorage, a particular type of seaweed marking a submerged reef. These were practical signposts, honed by direct experience, that offered a richness absent from my own geometric representations. It was a humbling lesson that the most profound knowledge often comes not from abstract theory, but from a deep lived connection to the earth and sea. I carried this understanding of integrated knowledge with me as I continued my work, knowing that the journey south would demand even greater reliance on both my instruments and the wisdom of those who lived where my maps would soon lie. The ship pushed further south along the vast African coast, a journey that felt like sailing towards the very edge of what our world understood. As we moved away from familiar European waters, the quality of the sea breeze began to change, carrying new scents that drifted in from the unseen lands inland. At times, the air would carry a delicate sweetness, like blooming jasmine flowers, a startling contrast to the constant sharp tang of salt that usually filled my senses. This subtle shift hinted at distant gardens and verdant growth, a world apart from the stark maritime expanses I had known. This new olfactory landscape painted a picture of a land teeming with life, a stark contrast to the often barren stretches we had already charted. We had navigated past the known ports of call, venturing into regions where the maps became less precise, mere suggestions of coastlines rather than accurate renderings. Such areas demanded constant vigilance, for hidden beneath the waves could lie treacherous reefs, sharp fingers of rock waiting to tear at the hull, unseen until the last moment. My focus narrowed, demanding absolute attention to the subtle changes in the water's color and the behavior of the seabirds, for these were often the only warnings of such submerged dangers. The task of charting these unknown stretches proved immensely challenging, pushing the limits of my understanding and the tools at my disposal. Each new formation of rock or curve of the shore required meticulous measurement, a process that was slow and painstaking. I would spend hours observing the stars through my quadrant, seeking to fix our position with the utmost accuracy. Yet the heavens themselves seemed to conspire against us. As we journeyed further from the equator, the familiar patterns of the northern stars began to fade, replaced by a new celestial tapestry. These alien constellations offered a different perspective on the sky, demanding a relearning of my astronomical craft. It felt as though the very firmament had shifted, forcing me to adapt my calculations. The isolation deepened with each passing day. The camaraderie of the crew, while present, could not entirely fill the void left by the absence of familiar sights and sounds. The sense of being truly alone on a vast ocean, charting what few others had dared to see, began to weigh upon me, a quiet, persistent pressure on my spirit. The captain, a man whose patience had been tested by the slow progress of our mission, often expressed his unease with our deliberate pace. He understood the financial implications of delayed voyages, the cost of every day spent at sea without returning with valuable cargo or completed surveys. His pragmatism, while understandable, often clashed with my commitment to accuracy. I knew that a flawed map, especially in these less understood waters, could lead to greater peril for future expeditions, making my dedication to detail a necessity, not a choice. My own internal struggle intensified with these pressures, a constant weighing of the immediate needs of the expedition against the long-term importance of reliable cartography. This balancing act was becoming the defining characteristic of my work, a dance between expediency and integrity. I recognized that the success of my grander ambition to map the route to India depended not only on my courage, but also on the trust others placed in the accuracy of my charts, a trust I could only earn through painstaking precision. The continuous charting of these southern regions, venturing into inlets and bays previously unrecorded, revealed the intricate diversity of this coastline. It was not a simple, uniform shore, but a complex arrangement of landforms, each with its own character and challenges. The presence of these unfamiliar coastal features, some appearing to emerge directly from the sea with little warning, underscored the limitations of our existing knowledge and the vital need for my efforts. The subtle variations in the water's appearance, from glassy stillness to agitated chop, became crucial indicators of hidden hazards. The days blended into a steady rhythm of observation, calculation, and recording, a cycle punctuated by the ship's movement and the changing sky. I found myself contemplating the immense responsibility of translating the three-dimensional reality of the world onto a flat piece of parchment. How could one truly capture the curve of the earth, the swell of the ocean, and the rise and fall of the land in a way that was both truthful and useful for those who would follow? This question echoed in my mind as I worked, a constant reminder of the art and science intertwined in my profession. My charting of the African coast had taken an unexpectedly challenging turn. The landscape continued its stark transformation, shedding the last vestiges of coastal green for the bleached hues of a land that seemed to drink the very color from the world. As our vessel navigated these drier expanses,
The earth itself felt parched beneath a sky that offered no respite. My skin quickly grew accustomed to a fine coating of grit, a constant reminder of the wind's relentless work on this arid shore. Even the simple act of breathing felt different here, as each inhalation brought a dryness that settled in the back of my throat, compelling me to seek the meager shade offered by the ship's rigging whenever my charting duties allowed. My charting of the African coast had taken an unexpectedly challenging turn. The landscape continued its stark transformation, shedding the last vestiges of coastal green for the bleached hues of a land that seemed to drink the very color from the world. As our vessel navigated these drier expanses, the earth itself felt parched beneath a sky that offered no respite. My skin quickly grew accustomed to a fine coating of grit, a constant reminder of the wind's relentless work on this arid shore. Even the simple act of breathing felt different here, as each inhalation brought a dryness that settled in the back of my throat, compelling me to seek the meager shade offered by the ship's rigging whenever my charting duties allowed.
This particular stretch of coastline presented a formidable challenge to our understanding of the land, for the usual markers on my charts seemed to desert us here, replaced by vast stretches of featureless sand and rock. The old maps, so often my reliable guides, offered little help in this desolate terrain. The sun's intensity, which I felt more as a steady drain on my energy than a direct assault, meant that prolonged work ashore required a careful husbanding of my own strength. A lesson learned quickly after a few hours of intense sketching left me feeling utterly spent. My work often took me ashore to examine rock formations and gather what topographical information I could, always accompanied by guards who eyed the empty horizons with a vigilance born of hard experience. One afternoon, while attempting to sketch a particularly weathered-out outcropping of rock, I noticed a small, almost imperceptible shimmer of moisture near its base. It was a tiny detail, easily missed, but knowing the critical nature of water in this region, I investigated further, carefully scraping away the dry surface soil with the edge of my trusty charting knife. What I uncovered was not a spring, but a faint dampness that hinted at reserves buried deep beneath the surface. This small discovery sparked a new line of thought. How did the people who lived in such places find sustenance? I recalled seeing, from a distance, small groups of figures moving along the coast, their ways of life entirely adapted to this challenging environment. They seemed to possess an innate understanding of this land, a knowledge that no parchment could ever fully convey, and I felt a growing curiosity about how I might begin to learn from them. It was during this period that our ship's cook, a man whose gruff exterior hid a surprisingly practical mind, began to experiment with preserving food in a new way. He had been drying fish over slow-burning fires made from a particular type of desert scrub, and the resulting product, though intensely salty, offered a durable and filling ration. He explained that the scrub burned with a clean, steady heat, and the technique was one he'd learned from sailors who'd traded along these very shores years ago. It was a simple adaptation, but one that made our daily meals far more sustaining. One evening, as the sky bled into shades of orange and purple, I was meticulously comparing the celestial observations I'd made that day with the predicted positions of the stars. A subtle but persistent discrepancy began to emerge, a deviation that suggested the stars themselves might be appearing slightly differently in this southern sky than our tables indicated. This was troubling, as accurate star positions were the bedrock of determining latitude, and any error here could ripple outwards into all my calculations. It was a puzzle that prickled at my professional pride and increased the pressure I felt to achieve absolute accuracy. This feeling of being on the edge of discovery, yet wrestling with unknown variables, was a recurring theme. I remembered a scholarly debate back in Lisbon about the precise nature of magnetic declination, the slight difference between true north and the direction a compass needle points.
Some argued it was a fixed anomaly, while others believed it varied based on longitude, a concept that would have profound implications for any true global mapping. Here, far from libraries and learned discussions, the practical reality of these differences seemed to manifest in the very way the sea and sky presented themselves. My attempts to communicate with the few inhabitants we encountered were often slow and fraught with misunderstanding. An elder from a small coastal settlement, his face a map of weathered lines, showed me how his people collected dew that condense on large flat stones overnight. He gathered it into hollowed gourds, a precious resource obtained through patient observation. He spoke, through gestures and a few shared words, of the seasons of rain and drought, and how their lives were governed by these cycles, a form of knowledge that felt ancient and deeply tied to the land. The sheer isolation of this region also began to weigh on me. The familiar sounds of Lisbon, the chatter of the marketplace, the ringing of church bells were a distant memory. Here, the dominant sounds were the sighing of the wind across the sands and the ceaseless whisper of the waves. The constant effort to find potable water, coupled with the limited diet, made me appreciate the relative abundance I had often taken for granted. Yet even in this starkness, there was a profound beauty, a raw, untamed character that spoke of resilience. My careful recording of coastal features, the shape of the bays, the height of the cliffs, and the subtle shifts in currents was a painstaking process. Each new piece of data was a small victory against the vastness of the unknown. The brackish taste of the water we were forced to drink became a familiar, unpleasant companion, a constant reminder of our reliance on the land's meager offerings and my own responsibility to ensure our navigations were as precise as possible, for the sake of the ship and the men who depended on my work. The implications of what I'd found on these arid shores would certainly unfold in time. The air near the coast carried a different scent now, not just the familiar salt, but a complex mix of damp earth and a floral sweetness I'd not encountered before. As our vessel dropped anchor in a calm bay, the sounds of the shore reached us, a vibrant chorus of bird calls, sharp and piercing, interspersed with the rhythmic thud of distant drums. This land, so different from the arid tracts we had recently navigated, pulsed with an unseen energy, and I felt a familiar stirring of curiosity deep within me. My purpose here, beyond charting the coastline, was to understand this place, to fill the blank spaces on my maps with something more than just lines and measurements. We lowered a smaller boat, rowing towards the shore where figures gathered, their skin dark like polished wood. Through a rough interpreter, a man whose own knowledge of the sea seemed as deep as any captain's, I began to engage with the local people. They spoke of hidden channels that avoided the treacherous reefs I had charted with such difficulty, and of predictable patterns in the tides that seemed to whisper secrets of the ocean's moods. These were not the calculations of astronomers, but the lived wisdom of those who had navigated these waters for generations, a testament to a different kind of understanding. We lowered a smaller boat, rowing towards the shore where figures gathered, their skin dark like polished wood. Through a rough interpreter, a man whose own knowledge of the sea seemed as deep as any captain's, I began to engage with the local people. They spoke of hidden channels that avoided the treacherous reefs I had charted with such difficulty, and of predictable patterns in the tides that seemed to whisper secrets of the ocean's moods. These were not the calculations of astronomers, but the lived wisdom of those who had navigated these waters for generations, a testament to a different kind of understanding. My own instruments, my astrolabe and quadrant, felt somewhat less vital in these conversations, though I still held them close. The people here used the positions of specific trees on the shore and the way certain seabirds flew inland at dusk to guide their journeys. They shared knowledge of safe anchorages, pointing to subtle breaks in the surf that concealed calm waters, places I had overlooked in my earnest pursuit of precise celestial readings. This direct exchange, this sharing of what seemed like simple observations, was a revelation, proving that the most accurate maps were drawn not just from the stars, but from the land itself and its people. I offered small quantities of the carefully prepared spices we carried, cloves and cinnamon, precious commodities that had arrived with us from distant ports. In return, they shared their understanding of the ocean currents, describing how they shifted with the seasons and how certain marine life indicated approaching weather. One elder, his face a roadmap of time, showed me how to read the faint, almost imperceptible ripples on the water surface that warned of submerged rocks, a skill far more practical than any abstract geometric principle when navigating these intricate waterways. This exchange was more than mere trade. It was a bridge between two worlds of knowledge, and I felt the profound significance of it settle upon me. Their charts were not drawn on parchment, but etched into the collective memory of their community, passed down through stories and practical demonstrations. I began to sketch these observations, noting landmarks they pointed out, the specific angles of bays, and the routes they favored during certain winds. The sheer volume of this localized knowledge was staggering, far more detailed than any existing European chart could offer. The captain, however, grew restless. He saw only the time spent in conversation and the potential for delays in our primary mission of trade. He urged me to focus on the broader coastal features, the kind of information that would be useful for large vessels, rather than these intricate specific details. For him, these were minor curiosities, distractions from the core business of reaching markets with goods. He reminded me of the investors back in Lisbon, eager for profit, and the strict timeline we were meant to adhere to.
This created a tension within me. Part of me understood the captain's pragmatic view, the immense cost of each day at sea, and the economic imperatives driving these voyages. Yet my cartographer's heart ached at the thought of leaving these invaluable local insights unrecorded, of returning to Europe with maps that, while perhaps more accurate in a general sense, still missed the true character of this coast. I felt a growing unease about the purpose of my work, realizing that these lands and their people were not merely empty spaces to be claimed by lines on a map, but places with their own histories and inhabitants. I found myself wrestling with a burgeoning ethical consideration. Was my charting of these shores a service, or was it a precursor to exploitation? The very knowledge I sought could be used by others to control trade, to impose their will. The generosity of the local people in sharing their hard-won understanding of their home struck a chord with my own yearning for knowledge, but it also highlighted the power imbalance inherent in our meeting. The spices I offered were valuable, but they could not truly represent the worth of the wisdom they imparted. The conversations continued, however, often with the captain standing aside, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon as if willing the ship to move. I learned about the importance of certain fishing grounds at specific times of the year, and how the behavior of the whales indicated changes in weather patterns far out at sea. These were not just navigational aids, they were interwoven with their rituals and their very way of life, demonstrating a profound symbiosis between the people and their environment that I had never before considered. I sought out individuals who seemed particularly knowledgeable, spending time with them ashore whenever possible, even when it meant slower progress. One fisherman, skilled in reading the faintest shifts in the water, showed me how to identify submerged sandbars by the subtle color changes of the sea surface, a detail that had caused us considerable difficulty only a few days prior. He demonstrated the specific way to approach a certain inlet during low tide, a maneuver that relied on an intimate understanding of the ebb and flow rather than simple depth measurements.
These encounters reinforced my belief that cartography was not a purely scientific pursuit detached from human context. It was a translation of lived experience into a form that others could use, and that translation carried significant weight. The potential for my maps to facilitate trade, which the captain so readily embraced, also meant the potential for disruption, for the imposition of foreign ways. This realization tempered my excitement for discovery with a newfound sense of responsibility for the knowledge I was accumulating and how it might be used. As the time for our departure from this bay drew near, I carefully organized the new sketches and notes I had made. They represented a richer, more nuanced understanding of this stretch of coast than anything I had previously possessed. The intricate details of local channels, the behavioral indicators of weather, and the subtle land-based markers were now part of my growing body of knowledge, complementing the astronomical data. This interaction with the local populations had fundamentally shifted my perspective on the very nature of mapping. My understanding of the world's interconnectedness had shifted in ways I hadn't expected. The world tilted violently, throwing me against the rough-hewn timbers of the ship. A roar unlike any sound I had ever heard drowned out the shouts of the crew. This was not the familiar sound of wind in the sails, but a savage fury that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the sky and sea. I grabbed for my inkpot, a frantic attempt to secure my precious tools, but it tumbled away, spilling its dark contents across the already damp deck. The ship groaned, a deep, pained sound that resonated in my very bones, as a wave, impossibly large, crashed over the deck, sending a torrent of cold salt water into everything. The sheer power of it all was humbling, yet a different kind of fear began to set in. My meticulously drawn charts, the culmination of weeks of careful observation and calculation, were in danger. This storm, I realized with a chilling certainty, was not just a trial for the ship and its men, but a crucible for my own work. Coastal features I had painstakingly recorded could be reshaped in an instant, rendering my fresh knowledge useless, or worse, dangerously misleading. The task of accurate mapping suddenly felt like a race against nature's relentless, unpredictable hand, a race I was now uncertain I could win. I scrambled to secure my surveying instruments, the brass cool and slick beneath my grasping fingers. The astrolabe, which had so recently guided us with celestial certainty, now felt like a fragile trinket against the immense forces arrayed against us. Securing the precious navigational logs was paramount. These were more than just records of our journey. They were the seeds of future voyages, the foundation upon which the next layer of understanding would be built. Each gust of wind that tore through the rigging felt like a personal assault, a reminder of my insignificance against such raw power. The crew, seasoned mariners though they were, moved with a desperate energy born of true peril. Their skill in securing the sails and managing the rigging was a testament to years of experience. Yet even their faces, etched with the harsh realities of the sea, showed a grim resignation. I found myself working alongside them, a cartographer suddenly pressed into the service of survival, tying down loose barrels and lashing down anything that threatened to become a projectile. This was a far cry from the quiet focus of the scriptorium, a chaotic symphony of wind, water, and the raw primal fear of men pushed to their limits. During this time, I saw a sailor named Miguel, a man known for his easy humor, lashed to the mast, his face a mask of grim determination as he fought to keep a flapping sail from tearing free. His struggle was a stark reminder of the human cost of such voyages, a cost far greater than any financial investment. We were not merely charting lines on a map. We were navigating a path that demanded immense courage and sacrifice from every soul aboard. It made me ponder the true purpose of my endeavors. Was it worth the risk, the potential for loss that this storm so vividly demonstrated? The water, which had earlier tasted of salt and brine, now seemed to carry a different kind of bitterness, an edge of desperation. Each time a wave broke over us, I was plunged into darkness and the shock of icy water, a repeated baptism that left me gasping for breath. The ship pitched and rolled with sickening lurches, throwing me off balance again and again. I tried to maintain my focus, to recall the principles of celestial navigation, but the violent motion made it nearly impossible to think clearly. The sky, when visible through the spray, was a churning, bruised canvas of gray and black. As the storm raged, an idea born of necessity began to form in my mind. The very force that threatened to destroy our progress might also offer new information. If I could observe how the waves reshaped the coastline, how the currents shifted, then this destructive event could, in its own terrible way, contribute to the accuracy of my charts. This was a thought that offered a glimmer of purpose amidst the chaos, a way to salvage something valuable from this ordeal. It was a cartographer's instinct, an almost compulsive need to record and understand, even in the face of overwhelming danger. This new perspective provided a subtle shift in my internal state. The fear, while still present, was tempered by a determined focus on the task ahead. I began to mentally note the patterns of the waves, the way they struck the hull, the sounds they made as they cascaded over the deck. These were not just random acts of destruction, they were forces that sculpted the very land I sought to map. Even the harsh mix of sounds, the relentless roar of the wind and the crashing waves, became a unique form of data, a sonic signature of this violent encounter. The ship's carpenter, a gruff but skilled man, worked tirelessly to repair minor damage. His hammer blows a steady, reassuring rhythm against the storm's cacophony. He spoke of how the sea could change the very shape of the land in a single night, a fact that underscored the dynamic nature of the world we were charting. His practical knowledge, gained from years of battling the elements, offered a different kind of wisdom than my theoretical calculations, a wisdom I found myself increasingly reliant upon. We were a team, each contributing what we could to survive, and hopefully to continue our mission. Moreover, the sheer physical effort required to simply remain upright and functioning was immense. My muscles ached from the constant bracing, and my hands were raw from gripping ropes and securing loose objects. The taste of salt seemed to have permeated everything, clinging to my lips and the inside of my mouth. It was a harsh reminder of the unforgiving nature of this endeavor, a stark contrast to the clean, dry air of the scriptorium. The journey was proving to be a demanding teacher, forcing me to adapt and learn in ways I had never anticipated. It also became clear that such powerful storms were not uncommon in these southern waters, a piece of knowledge I had only read about in fragmented accounts. The old Arab charts, which had been so carefully preserved, had hinted at such dangers, but experiencing them firsthand was an entirely different matter. This understanding was vital. It meant that any mapping of this region must account for the potential for rapid and dramatic changes to the coast, making meticulous, repeated observation all the more crucial. A single charting of a particular stretch of coast might be rendered obsolete by a single powerful tempest. The storm finally began to abate as dawn approached, leaving behind a scene of considerable disarray, but thankfully no irreparable damage to the ship itself. The sky, though still overcast, showed signs of breaking, and the sea, while rough, had lost its earlier terrifying ferocity. We had weathered the worst of it, and a collective sigh of relief rippled through the exhausted crew. My own relief was profound, a physical easing of the tension that had gripped me for hours, yet it was mixed with a sense of deep introspection. The storm had tested me in ways I was only beginning to grasp. The salty tang of Lisbon's air, so familiar from the docks, now carried a different kind of keenness as I walked through the city's narrower streets. Sunlight, filtering through overhanging eaves, warmed the stone beneath my worn soles, a welcome sensation after the relentless ocean spray. My journey back from the green coast had been a relief, a chance to finally process the raw observations that had filled my logbooks. Back within the scriptorium's comforting embrace, the familiar dry scent of ink and aged parchment greeted me, a stark contrast to the damp earth and lush vegetation I had recently charted. My instruments, my trusted companions through the voyage, were laid out carefully on my workbench. I began the painstaking work of incorporating the new data onto the existing charts of the African coast. This process, more than any other, tested my understanding of how to represent a spherical world upon a flat surface. It involved complex calculations, a careful translation of angles and distances observed under the vast sky into the precise lines and symbols that would guide future mariners. Each correction, each newly plotted coastline felt like a victory against the vast, indifferent ocean and the inaccuracies of past endeavors. It was a dance of mathematics and observation, a constant striving for a truth that the sea itself seemed to guard jealously. The techniques I employed were not new, but the application of them to these newly explored regions was a testament to the progress we were making. We used triangulation, measuring angles from known points to determine distances and positions, and relied heavily on celestial navigation. Observing the altitude of the sun at noon or the position of familiar stars like the North Star allowed us to calculate our latitude with a reasonable degree of certainty. Yet estimating longitude, our position east or west, remained a far greater challenge, requiring precise timekeeping, a luxury not yet fully mastered on these longer voyages, making the very shape of distant lands a careful estimation. Royal patrons, those who funded these ambitious expeditions, were pleased with the reports of progress and the initial sketches of the coastline. They showered me with commendations, words of praise that warmed my spirit, but they also carried a subtle pressure. Their questions quickly turned to the next steps, to the potential for further expansion and the ever-present desire to find that fabled sea route to the east. Their enthusiasm, while understandable, often overlooked the sheer effort and meticulousness required to chart even a small stretch of unfamiliar territory accurately. This ambition to finally map the complete sea route to India, a dream whispered in the scriptorium and fueled by the promise of untold riches and knowledge, burned brighter than ever. However, my time back in Lisbon also presented a different kind of challenge, a contemplative pause that brought with it new reflections on the impact of my work. The commendations were satisfying, yet they did not entirely erase the memories of the trading company's captain, his eagerness to turn a profit over careful measurement. The patrons, eager for expansion, spoke of routes and trade, of securing Portugal's dominance. Yet I had witnessed firsthand the quiet dignity of the people along the coast, their deep understanding of the land and sea. My maps, I realized, were not merely lines on parchment. They were instruments that would guide ships, facilitating not only trade, but also the assertion of our dominion. This realization brought a growing sense of unease, a gnawing question about the ultimate purpose of the knowledge I so diligently gathered and the potential consequences for those whose lands I charted. The complex archipelagos of the East, while still a distant prospect, loomed in my thoughts. I understood that charting those waters would present even greater navigational complexities, requiring a refinement of techniques I had only just begun to master. The subtle inconsistencies I had noted in celestial observations and the effects of unseen ocean currents were magnified in these more intricate regions, and the limited tools available for measuring longitude remained a constant, frustrating obstacle. My time in Lisbon was also filled with observations of the very trade that my work facilitated. I saw the bustling markets, the exchange of goods from distant shores, and the faces of sailors recounting tales of hardship and fortune. The rich scents of exotic spices, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper that filled the air in these trading hubs were a welcome sensory change from the pervasive salt of the open sea, a reminder of the world's vast diversity that my maps aimed to connect. During this period of respite, I meticulously refined my calculations, cross-referencing my own observations with the fragmented accounts from earlier voyages. The process involved more than just drawing lines. It demanded an understanding of perspective, of how to translate the vastness of the three-dimensional world onto the flat plane of the chart. This often meant making educated estimations, carefully weighing the probabilities based on the available data and my own growing experience. The intricate process of projecting the curved surface of the Earth onto a flat map, a mathematical puzzle that had occupied thinkers for centuries, was now my daily work. I utilized principles of geometry and trigonometry, converting spherical coordinates into planar ones, a task that required immense precision and a deep well of astronomical knowledge. Each symbol, each line, had to be placed with absolute accuracy, for a single error could lead a ship astray, costing lives and fortunes. While my colleagues often focused on the speed of their output, I found myself drawn to the deeper intricacies of the craft. The patrons, ever pushing for more territory to be mapped, more routes to be secured, often overlooked the time it took to ensure true accuracy. They saw only the potential for profit, while I saw the profound responsibility that came with shaping the known world, a responsibility that demanded patience and an unwavering commitment to precision, even when faced with impatience.
This encounter with the delicate balance between ambition and responsibility lingered in my thoughts. Preparations for a new, more extensive journey south along the African coast were well underway in Lisbon. The bustling shipyard, a familiar yet always overwhelming place, hummed with activity. Cranes groaned under the weight of new timbers, the sharp scent of freshly cut wood mingling with the persistent smell of tar and brine. Sailors, their faces etched by sun and sea, moved with a practiced urgency, their rough woven tunics brushing against crates stacked high with provisions. I felt a peculiar mix of anticipation and a new, quiet apprehension. My earlier voyages, charting the known edges of the western coast, had been demanding but straightforward. Now, the whispers of the trading companies, and indeed the Crown itself, spoke of pushing further, of reaching lands rumored to hold untold riches, lands so distant they were mere phantoms on the most optimistic of maps. This growing ambition for the East, for the fabled Spice Islands, cast a long shadow over my professional satisfaction. The weight of my earlier work, the charts I had so carefully compiled and refined, now felt like both an accomplishment and a burden. These lines on parchment, born from my meticulous observations and the careful calibration of my instruments, like the astrolabe and quadrant, had a power I had not fully grasped in the quiet solitude of the scriptorium. I had seen how my detailed depictions of coastlines and prevailing winds, once presented to merchants, directly influenced the routes their ships would take. Now, with talk of grander ventures, of voyages that would push the boundaries of the known world further than ever before,
I understood that my maps would be more than just navigational aids. They could be tools for expanding empires, for facilitating trade that brought great wealth, but also, I was beginning to suspect, carried its own costs. This realization gnawed at me, a counterpoint to the exhilarating thrill of discovery. I found myself in deep conversation with a seasoned navigator, a man whose beard was as white as the sea foam on a winter's day. He spoke of the immense risks involved in the upcoming expedition, of storms that could swallow entire ships whole, and of unfamiliar currents that could disorient the most experienced mariners. He pointed to a newly acquired but still incomplete chart of the southern reaches. "These are places where the old maps grow thin, João," he had said, his voice raspy, "and where the will of man must contend with the temper of the ocean." His words struck a chord, for while my fascination with charting these unknown territories remained, I was also increasingly aware of the human element behind the grand ambitions of exploration. The talk was of wealth and prestige, but I had witnessed firsthand the toll such ventures took on the common sailor, the often meager rewards they received for risking their lives. The preparations also included a grim reminder of the human cost of this expanding enterprise. I saw families bidding tearful farewells to their husbands and sons at the docks, their faces a mixture of pride and deep-seated fear. These were the men who would brave the unpredictable seas, guided by the lines I drew. I overheard snippets of conversation from merchants discussing the contracts for valuable commodities, their voices filled with an almost detached eagerness, as if the human lives involved were merely a footnote to their ledgers. This stark contrast between the grand vision of discovery and the raw, often harsh reality of the lives that made it possible began to foster a deep internal conflict within me. The lure of charting the unknown was powerful, but the growing awareness of its implications weighed heavily on my conscience. During this time, I met with officials from the trading company that had funded my previous work. They were pleased with the accuracy of my charts from the West African coast, their faces breaking into broad smiles as they spoke of increased profits. They presented me with the preliminary plans for the new voyage, a journey that would take us far beyond the equator, into regions barely sketched on any map. They spoke of the spice trade, of the wealth that lay in the east, and how my skills were essential to opening these new routes. I felt a surge of pride at their recognition, a validation of years of painstaking work and study. Yet, as they outlined the ambitious schedule, emphasizing speed and the need to secure trade agreements with newly encountered peoples, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. The reality of the maritime trade was not always as pristine as the geometric principles I applied to my charts. I had seen, on my last expedition, how quickly the initial spirit of exchange could turn to coercion when perceived interests were at stake. The accounts of some explorers, whispered in taverns and back rooms, spoke of exploitative practices, of peoples whose lands and resources were taken with little regard for their way of life. This knowledge, absorbed through hushed conversations and the worried glances of seasoned sailors, began to color my perception of the grand voyages. My maps, I realized, were not just about understanding geography. They were about enabling actions, about facilitating interactions, and the nature of those interactions was not always honorable. I found myself torn between the pure intellectual satisfaction of accurate mapping and the burgeoning understanding of the potential consequences of that knowledge. My scientific curiosity, the innate drive to fill in the blanks on the world's canvas, was a powerful force. It was the same drive that had compelled me to spend countless hours in the scriptorium, to master the intricate calculations for determining latitude, and to endure the discomforts of long sea voyages. However, this curiosity was now intertwined with a growing unease. Was my pursuit of accurate charting inadvertently contributing to the exploitation of distant lands and their inhabitants? The question was a difficult one, and my heart felt heavy as I contemplated the answer. One evening, as I walked through the narrow streets of Lisbon, the scent of fresh bread wafting from a nearby bakery, I observed a group of merchants animatedly discussing the potential profits from a newly opened trade route. Their laughter was boisterous, their gestures wide, as they spoke of spices and silks. Across the square, however, I saw a small group of sailors, their faces gaunt, their clothes worn thin. They were sharing a simple meal, their conversation quiet and subdued. This juxtaposition struck me with profound force. The merchants' wealth was built on the backs of these men, and ultimately on the resources of lands I was helping to make more accessible. It was a realization that made the prospect of my next voyage feel far more complex than merely drawing lines on a piece of parchment. I tried to explain my reservations to my former mentor, the older cartographer whose insights had guided me so much. He listened patiently, his kind eyes reflecting the lamplight. "João," he said, his voice soft but firm, "the world is a vast and complex place, and our understanding of it grows through courage and dedication. Your skill is a gift, and like all gifts, it can be used for good or ill. The choice, ultimately, rests with the heart that wields it." He then shared a story of a particular expedition, where accurate charts had saved countless lives during a sudden tempest, allowing ships to find safe harbor. This reminder of the practical, life-saving applications of my craft offered a measure of reassurance, a counterpoint to my growing doubts. This period also brought a shift in the types of debates I encountered among scholars and navigators. While previously the focus was on the technical challenges of navigation and the verification of existing geographical knowledge, discussions now frequently revolved around the right to explore and claim newly discovered territories. There were heated arguments, sometimes polite, sometimes less so, about which nations had priority, and whether the inhabitants of these lands had any inherent rights. I heard learned men citing ancient texts to justify claims of dominion, while others, though fewer, spoke of a common humanity that transcended borders. These discussions further complicated my internal conflict, forcing me to consider the broader political and ethical dimensions of my profession. Despite these inner qualms, the preparations for the next voyage continued with relentless momentum. The ship I was assigned to was a sturdy carrack, its timbers solid and well-maintained, smelling faintly of dried herbs used to ward off illness. The captain, a man known for his stern demeanor and unwavering resolve, inspected my instruments with a critical eye, ensuring everything was in order. He spoke of the king's eagerness for news of the eastern routes, of the prestige such a discovery would bring to Portugal. He did not seem troubled by the ethical questions that occupied my thoughts, his focus solely on the success of the mission and the potential rewards. His pragmatic approach, while necessary for the voyage's success, served as a stark contrast to my own evolving perspective. The sheer volume of supplies being loaded onto the ship was impressive. Barrels of salted meat, sacks of hardtack, crates of wine, and countless bolts of cloth were maneuvered onto the deck with shouts and the creak of ropes. Among the provisions, I noticed a large quantity of spices, destined not for consumption, but for trade. Cardamom, cloves, and peppercorns, gathered from distant shores, were being loaded with as much care as the navigational tools. This tangible presence of the very goods we sought underscored the economic motivations driving these ambitious explorations. The scent of these precious commodities, even in their unrefined state, filled the air near the cargo holds, a potent reminder of the ultimate purpose of our journey. I still recall a light-hearted moment amidst the bustle. A young cabin boy, struggling to haul a heavy coil of rope, tripped and sent a cascade of polished brass instruments tumbling across the deck. For a moment, my heart leaped into my throat, imagining the damage to my precious sextant and compass. But thankfully, they landed on a soft pile of sailcloth, unharmed save for a few minor scuffs. The boy, mortified, stammered apologies, and I, after a sigh of relief, could only muster a gentle smile and a reassuring nod. It was a small incident, easily forgotten, yet it highlighted the precariousness of our endeavor, the constant potential for mishaps to derail even the most meticulously planned undertakings. As the ship prepared to set sail, the quays of Lisbon were alive with activity. Families gathered to bid farewell, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The air, though not heavy, carried the murmur of countless voices, the sharp cries of gulls, and the distant tolling of church bells. I watched as the last of the mooring ropes were cast off, the vessel slowly pulling away from the familiar embrace of the harbor. The vast blue expanse of the Atlantic stretched before us, an immense and challenging frontier. I had witnessed something that would stay with me, the profound realization that the lines I drew on paper held the power to shape not just routes, but destinies, and that my role as a cartographer was becoming increasingly entwined with the complex tapestry of human ambition and its far-reaching consequences. The sails billowed taut as our vessel carved a path through waters that grew increasingly unfamiliar. We had journeyed east from the familiar shores of Africa, the scent of salt slowly giving way to something else entirely on the breeze, a perfume of distant spices, hints of cardamom, and perhaps even cloves, carried from lands whispered about in hushed tones by returning sailors. These were the fabled Spice Islands, a destination that had fueled dreams and expeditions for decades, a mirage of untold wealth that lured men across vast oceans. The archipelago we now navigated presented a bewildering array of islands, each with its own distinct coastline and hidden hazards, making the task of accurate charting more challenging than ever before. Local knowledge, shared hesitantly and often at great cost, proved both vital and maddeningly contradictory. Fishermen in small, agile canoes would point towards safe passages, their gestures conveying warnings of submerged rocks, yet their directions for understanding the subtle shifts in currents often clashed with what the stars seemed to tell me. My astrolabe and quadrant, tools I trusted implicitly, were yielding readings that, when cross-referenced with these disparate pieces of advice, suggested geographical features that simply did not align with the existing fragments of maps. This inconsistency was not merely an academic puzzle. It represented a profound navigational hurdle, a constant reminder of the limitations of our current methods for determining one's precise east-west position, or longitude. The estimation of longitude, in particular, remained an elusive phantom, a measurement that danced just beyond my grasp. While I could accurately determine our latitude, our north-south position, by observing the angle of the pole star or other celestial bodies, knowing how far east or west we were proved a far greater trial. The passage of time itself became the critical element, requiring an incredibly accurate chronometer, a device we did not yet possess, to compare local noon with the time at a known meridian. Without it, each calculation was an educated guess, influenced by the very currents and winds that might be pushing us off course, creating a feedback loop of uncertainty that gnawed at my resolve. The estimation of longitude, in particular, remained an elusive phantom, a measurement that danced just beyond my grasp. While I could accurately determine our latitude, our north-south position, by observing the angle of the pole star or other celestial bodies, knowing how far east or west we were proved a far greater trial. The passage of time itself became the critical element, requiring an incredibly accurate chronometer, a device we did not yet possess, to compare local noon with the time at a known meridian. Without it, each calculation was an educated guess, influenced by the very currents and winds that might be pushing us off course, creating a feedback loop of uncertainty that gnawed at my resolve. Navigating these complex island chains demanded a constant re-evaluation of my approach. I spent hours meticulously observing the subtle changes in watercolor, noting the patterns of foam that indicated shallows, and recording the distinctive shapes of coastal cliffs as they appeared on the horizon. These direct observations were the bedrock of my work, the raw material that I hoped would refine the existing, often generalized depictions of these regions. The sheer number of islets and bays meant that each day brought a new set of features to record, a continuous process of adding detail to the evolving canvas of the world. In the bustling ports where we occasionally anchored, the very air was alive with the rich aromas of commerce. Piles of cinnamon bark, saffron threads, and star anise were displayed openly, their potent scents mingling with the brine of the sea and the wood smoke from cooking fires. I found myself drawn to these vibrant centers, not just for the sensory feast, but for the opportunity to glean further fragments of local wisdom. Merchants, eager to secure favorable trading positions, sometimes shared their knowledge of safe anchorages and seasonal weather patterns, insights gained from generations of seafaring experience that no celestial observation could replicate. However, even this local wisdom came with its own set of complications. The same currents described by one village elder might be altered by monsoon winds that blew at a different time of year, or by the very act of dredging a new harbor for trade. This meant that the knowledge I acquired had to be carefully filtered, compared against my own observations and, when possible, against the accounts of other seasoned mariners who had passed this way. The pursuit of accuracy in such a dynamic environment was a constant negotiation between theory and practice, between the predictable movements of the stars and the capricious nature of the ocean. I recall a particular instance near a cluster of volcanic islands where the local people spoke of a singing passage, a channel through treacherous reefs that was only safe to navigate at specific tides, guided by the sound of the wind whistling through rock formations. The description was poetic, but translating such an evocative phrase into precise navigational instructions for a large vessel proved to be a formidable task. I spent 2 full days observing the tides, the wind's direction, and the sound of the waves crashing against the submerged coral, trying to find a pattern that corresponded with the sailors' descriptions. This constant tension between the desire for exactitude and the inherent uncertainties of exploration weighed heavily upon me. The pressure to complete the charting and move on to the next destination was ever present, particularly from the ship's master, who was keen to fulfill his trading quotas. He saw my meticulous work as a delay, a squandering of precious time that could be used for profitable transactions. He would often remark that a good enough map that allowed us to find our way was sufficient, but I knew that for the future, for voyages that would venture even further, precision was paramount. The implications of my work began to feel heavier during this period. My charts were not merely lines on parchment, they were tools that would guide others, shaping their routes and influencing the flow of goods and, by extension, power. Witnessing the intense competition for control over the spice trade, the sometimes harsh bargaining, and the clear inequalities between trading vessels and local fishing fleets, I started to question the broader impact of my cartographic endeavors. Was my pursuit of knowledge solely about understanding the shape of the world, or was it also about enabling the expansion of certain economic and political interests? These thoughts prompted me to seek out quieter moments, to allow the environment itself to offer its own lessons. Away from the crowded docks and the demanding schedules of the voyage, I would walk along deserted beaches, feeling the rough grains of sand beneath my feet and listening to the rhythmic washing of waves. It was in these moments of solitude, surrounded by the natural world, that I could reflect on the true purpose of my craft, on the balance between the objective recording of data and the subjective interpretation of the world's complexities. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day of conflicting charts and elusive currents, I sat on the deck, the vastness of the star-filled sky above me. I considered the countless generations who had navigated by the stars and by intuition, their journeys charting the course of human history long before my instruments existed. This contemplation led me to wonder what future generations, equipped with even more advanced tools, would discover about the world and how they would perceive the efforts of those who came before them. My cartographer's training had led me to this unexpected moment of profound reflection. Years had etched lines around my eyes, a map of the sun's passage and the vastness I'd traversed. I no longer felt like the eager apprentice who had once meticulously inked coastlines in the quiet scriptorium. The sea had a way of stripping away youthful pretenses, leaving behind a core of hard-won understanding. Isolation had taught me patience, the kind that settles deep in your bones, allowing you to watch and wait for the subtle shifts of wind and current. My hands, once steady with the fine point of a quill, now held the roughest ropes with a practiced familiarity, my grip strengthened by years of gripping helm and chart alike. The resilience forged in those long voyages was not a conscious choice, but a slow, inevitable hardening against the relentless demands of the ocean. I recalled a particular passage, a stretch of weeks where the familiar constellations seemed to mock me with their altered positions, forcing me to rely solely on dead reckoning, the art of calculating position based on speed, direction, and time. Each sunrise brought a fresh wave of uncertainty, a challenge to trust my calculations and the sturdy timbers of the ship. This constant testing of one's limits, however, also bred a quiet confidence, a knowledge that I had faced the vast unknown and continued to find my way. The resilience forged in those long voyages was not a conscious choice, but a slow, inevitable hardening against the relentless demands of the ocean. I recalled a particular passage, a stretch of weeks where the familiar constellations seemed to mock me with their altered positions, forcing me to rely solely on dead reckoning, the art of calculating position based on speed, direction, and time. Each sunrise brought a fresh wave of uncertainty, a challenge to trust my calculations and the sturdy timbers of the ship. This constant testing of one's limits, however, also bred a quiet confidence, a knowledge that I had faced the vast unknown and continued to find my way. This deepening understanding of human endurance extended beyond my own experiences, encompassing the quiet strength of the crew. I remembered the shared meals, simple fare of salted meat and hardtack, eaten with a camaraderie that transcended language and origin. On one such evening, a seasoned sailor, a man whose face was as weathered as an ancient map, spoke of his homeland and the traditions of his people, describing how they read the stars, not just for navigation, but for guidance in planting crops and celebrating life. It struck me then how my own pursuit of knowledge, while grand, was just one facet of a world filled with other equally vital ways of understanding existence. My growing awareness of the world's interconnectedness also brought a sober reflection on the impact of my charting. I had begun with a pure desire to fill in the blanks, to bring order to the world's vast oceans. Yet, as I saw the trade routes I helped define carry not just goods, but also influence and sometimes subjugation, a weight settled upon me. The intricate details I painstakingly added to my charts were not merely lines on parchment. They were pathways, opening the world to new possibilities, both beneficial and detrimental. This realization was a far cry from the simple satisfaction of drawing a perfectly rendered coastline. The memory of a particular storm, one that had lashed our ship for 3 days and nights, still felt like a physical ache. The sheer power of nature was humbling, a stark reminder that even the most accurate charts could be rendered useless by the sea's caprice. When the tempest finally relented, the coastline we had carefully mapped was altered, familiar landmarks shifted by the churning waters. I spent days meticulously recharting the altered bays and inlets, the wet paper clinging to my fingers as I corrected the lines, a silent testament to the dynamic, ever-changing nature of the world I sought to capture. It was during this recalibration that I truly grasped the dynamic nature of geography.
One curious detail that emerged from my time spent in bustling foreign ports was the elaborate system of bartering practiced in some Eastern markets. I observed merchants not just exchanging goods, but also sharing seeds of new plants and discussing farming techniques, a form of knowledge transfer as vital as any navigational chart. This exchange of agricultural wisdom, carried by sailors and traders, helped to weave a tapestry of interconnectedness across distant lands, a fact often overlooked by those who saw only the economic gains of exploration. It was a different kind of mapping, one that charted the flow of life itself. The scholarly debate surrounding the precise measurement of longitude, a puzzle that occupied the minds of many great thinkers of my era, continued to challenge me. While my work charting coastlines was praised, the ability to accurately determine one's east-west position at sea remained elusive. The limited tools available, the reliance on precise timekeeping, and the subtle variations in celestial movements meant that even the most skilled navigator could be hundreds of miles off course. This ongoing puzzle fueled my desire to seek out ever more accurate methods, a quest that felt deeply personal. My colleagues in Lisbon often spoke of the immense wealth generated by these new routes, their conversations a lively mix of ledgers and the gleam of gold. However, during a brief return to port, I overheard a heated discussion among ship owners regarding the cost of maintaining crews on extended voyages, a practical concern that often overshadowed the human element of these expeditions. They spoke of the sailors as necessary yet replaceable parts of a larger economic engine, a perspective that chilled me, knowing intimately the faces and stories of the men who braved the elements. The subtle shifts in the stars as we journeyed south became a language I began to understand, a visual dialect spoken by the heavens. I learned to associate the appearance of certain constellations with specific wind patterns or the proximity of known land masses, a knowledge passed down through generations of mariners and sometimes shared with me in quiet moments. This intuitive understanding, combined with my instruments, created a more complete picture of our position, a blend of the scientific and the experiential. It was a privilege to learn these ancient secrets directly from those who had lived them. Looking back, the years had been a testament to a different kind of journey, one inward as much as outward. The eagerness of my youth had matured into a profound respect for the delicate balance of knowledge and its application. I had witnessed firsthand the transformative power of charting the unknown, and with that power came a responsibility I now carried as keenly as my sextant. The world was no longer a series of blank spaces waiting to be filled, but a complex, living entity, each part intimately connected to the next. The accumulated wisdom I'd gathered felt both heavy and precious.
My hands, accustomed to the steady scratch of quill on parchment, now felt the rough grain of newly tanned leather. The years had brought a different kind of focus, one honed not by the quiet study of existing maps, but by the demanding reality of creating them. I remembered the scriptorium in Lisbon, the subtle fragrance of drying ink, and the cool, smooth feel of polished brass instruments against my fingertips. That was a world of carefully copied lines and the whisper of theoretical knowledge, a stark contrast to the vivid imprint of the world etched not just onto vellum, but also onto my very being. This profound shift in my understanding had begun subtly, much like the slow turning of seasons along the African coast. The initial voyages, commissioned to verify and update charts, had quickly revealed the limitations of relying solely on the work of others. I recall the first instances of encountering coastal features that deviated significantly from what I had meticulously studied. A disquieting realization that the world itself was a more dynamic and unpredictable canvas than any chart could fully represent. This necessitated a new approach, one where my own observations became the primary source of truth. The weight of the voyages, stretching across vast oceans and many months, had undeniably altered me. The eager young cartographer who had first calibrated his astrolabe with such meticulous care was now a seasoned navigator. His understanding deepened by the relentless rhythm of the sea and the quiet resilience required to face its challenges. I had learned to read the sky, not just for celestial positions, but for the subtle warnings of an approaching squall, and to gauge the strength of currents by the subtle shifts in the ship's steady roll. Sensory knowledge hard-won.
This hard-won expertise meant that upon returning to Lisbon for brief intervals, the process of refining the shape of the world felt far more complex. It involved not just redrawing lines, but integrating a lifetime of experience, translating the feel of damp earth after a sudden downpour in a foreign land, or the particular cry of a specific seabird into precise cartographical data. The mathematical principles of projecting a curved Earth onto a flat surface, once an abstract pursuit, now demanded a tangible connection to the physical world I had traversed. The push from royal patrons to continue exploring, to push ever further towards the fabled Spice Islands, remained a constant pressure. Yet with each journey, my perspective on the purpose of my charting had broadened, and at times it had also become clouded. I had witnessed the efficiency with which my maps could facilitate not only trade, but also the extension of influence, and this realization brought with it a growing sense of unease about the ultimate consequences of the knowledge I helped disseminate across the seas. It was during one of these returns to the bustling port of Lisbon that I saw it clearly, the interconnectedness of all things. The spices that flowed from the east, the very reason for so many perilous voyages, were tied to complex systems of agriculture and local economies in lands far from Europe. My maps, intended to chart courses for ships, were also inadvertently charting paths for cultural exchange, for economic shifts, and for the inevitable interactions between peoples who had previously known little of each other. The process of incorporating the data from these voyages was meticulous. I would spend hours hunched over my work table, the scent of drying ink once again familiar, but now layered with the memory of exotic spices encountered in bustling foreign ports. Each curve of the coastline, each indication of a safe harbor, represented a personal trial overcome, a moment of discovery secured. This work was more than just drawing lines. It was an attempt to give form to the vast, intangible immensity of the world. During these periods of reassessment, the sheer challenge of accurately estimating longitude at sea remained a persistent hurdle, a testament to the ongoing limitations of our navigational tools. The desire for more precise methods burned brighter than ever, a professional yearning that fueled my continued dedication to the craft.
This pursuit of accuracy was not merely academic. It was tied directly to the safety and success of the voyages that followed, and therefore to the lives of those who sailed under my guidance. The years had passed, and the man who now sat in the harbor taverns, listening to the tales of returning sailors, was far from the eager apprentice who had first studied fragmented charts. The resilience forged in prolonged isolation, the grim understanding of human endurance when faced with hardship, and the quiet wisdom gained from witnessing both life and death at sea had left their mark. I carried the psychological toll of these long voyages, the echoes of lost shipmates, and a far deeper appreciation for the intricate web that connected distant lands. This journey through charting the world had not been a solitary endeavor in its impact. My maps, once a personal quest for knowledge, had become instruments that opened new trade routes, facilitated further exploration, and irrevocably altered the perception of the known world. I often contemplated the ethical considerations inherent in my profession, the delicate balance between the thrill of discovery and the very real consequences that followed its charting and subsequent exploitation. The relentless human drive to chart the unknown, to push beyond familiar horizons, had shaped me into the man I had become. It was a drive that had begun with a fascination for geometry and astronomy in the quietude of a scriptorium, and had ultimately led me across oceans, into contact with diverse cultures, and through the crucible of the sea's unpredictable nature. This quest for understanding the world's shape had, in turn, reshaped my own inner landscape. The sensory tapestry of these experiences was rich and varied. I recalled the taste of tart tamarind offered by a wise elder on a remote shore, a flavor as complex and revealing as any navigational calculation. The smooth feel of river stones, worn by centuries of flowing water, offered a tactile connection to the land's enduring presence, a grounding sensation amidst the constant movement of the ships. These moments, small in themselves, contributed to the vast mosaic of knowledge I was piecing together. Looking out at the endless expanse of the ocean, I often wondered about the invisible currents that guided not only ships, but also the flow of human ambition and interaction. My work, the careful laying down of lines on parchment, was an attempt to make sense of this vast, fluid reality. It was a constant dialogue between the predictable patterns of the stars and the ever-changing face of the earth, a dialogue that had profoundly altered how I saw the world around me. This contemplation brought to mind a question that often arose in my quiet moments. How much of our understanding of the world is shaped by the very tools we use to measure it? The charts I created, while striving for accuracy, also imposed a structure, a framework, upon the raw reality of geography and human experience. It was a balance I had spent my life trying to understand, and one that continued to occupy my thoughts. People who heard my accounts often spoke of the bravery it must have taken, the sheer courage required to sail into the unknown. Yet for me, it was less about bravery and more about an insistent curiosity, a deep-seated need to understand what lay beyond the edge of what was known. This drive, once a quiet whisper in the scriptorium, had become the guiding force of my existence, leading me to the very edges of the world as we knew it. The echoes of the voyages, the sights and sounds, and even the very feel of distant lands remained vivid. The memory of specific bird calls, distinct from those of home, would sometimes drift back on the sea breeze, a reminder of the diverse life that flourished across the globe. Similarly, the rough texture of woven cloth, different from the familiar weaves of Portugal, spoke of the varied skills and traditions of the peoples I encountered, adding layers to my mapping. My work, therefore, was not merely about capturing geographical features. It was about mapping human connections, about understanding how different peoples interacted with their environments and with each other. This experiential learning had gone far beyond the initial focus on astronomical observation and the precise calibration of instruments, delving into the complexities of human societies and their relationship with the land they inhabited. The cumulative effect of years spent at sea, meticulously charting coastlines and navigating unseen currents, had provided a unique perspective on the Earth's interconnectedness. From the arid shores where survival depended on subtle signs of water, to the vibrant green coasts alive with unfamiliar sounds, each location offered a distinct lesson in adaptation and endurance. These experiences were not mere data points, but living lessons that informed every line I drew. Therefore, this immersion in the world's vastness had fundamentally changed my perception of my own place within it. The careful, deliberate act of rendering a coastline onto paper was now deeply intertwined with a broader understanding of history, culture, and the enduring human spirit of exploration that had brought me to these distant shores. My professional journey had become inextricably linked to a deep personal engagement with the planet's diverse realities. The process of translating my experiences onto charts felt like an ongoing conversation with the world itself. Each return to my workspace in Lisbon was an opportunity to refine the shape of the world as I had come to know it, a continuous effort to capture its essence. This deep engagement with the physical world through direct observation and the application of navigational science had indeed altered how I perceived the world around me.
As the stars begin to pierce the velvet cloak of night, let us drift away with the quiet hum of Portugal's age of discovery. Imagine our mapmaker, his quill now laid to rest, the ink drying on charts that unveiled distant shores. Think of the meticulous lines, the patient shading, the careful rendering of lands previously only whispered in legend. The vast ocean, so daunting in the daytime, now lies calm and serene. The same currents that carried brave caravels across uncharted waters now whisper a lullaby, a gentle rhythm to ease you into slumber. May the peace found in those meticulously crafted maps surround you now. Rest deeply and let the quiet stillness of the night carry you to dreams as vast and wondrous as the world our mapmakers explored. Sleep soundly.